Welcome back to Storytime Dark. We're visiting each state in America one by one, gathering the scariest stories and urban legends we could find. This episode we head to New York, where we have 3 chilling stories lines up. I will also remind all our listeners you can visit these locations in person. If you like this type of content and want to join this trip across America, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or drop a like. What state should we visit next? What stories would you like to see on the next New York video? Let us know in the comments. Story 1. General Slocum's sinking. This tragedy was the single deadliest event in New York City history until September 11, 2001. This disaster virtually wiped out the German presence on the Lower East Side. Entire families perished, many of whom had just gotten a foothold in New York a generation before. The boat had been chartered by St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church for their yearly day trip excursion to the Long Island Sound. The East River was filled with excursion steamers such as the General Slocum and its sister ship the Grand Republic. The Slocum left the pier shortly before 9 a.m. and began its slow crawl up the East River. Captain William Van Schaik had been principally concerned that morning with one turbulent spot up the East River, a dangerous confluence of waters known as the Hell Gate. It had already sunk hundreds of vessels as far back as the 17th century. By 1904 it was still a dangerous pass, but on this day, the Hell Gate would not be the problem. About 30 minutes into the voyage, a child noticed that a small fire had started in the lamp room below the main deck. A crewman tried to stamp it out, throwing charcoal on it in an effort to contain it. But the flames only grew larger. Crew members grabbed a fire hose, only to find it rotten to the point that it burst wide open. These were not men trained for emergency situations. Once they realized the hoses were useless, they simply gave up. Civilized behavior soon gave way to panic as the flames quickly spread through the lower levels of the steamer, fire jumping from passengers' clothing to hair. Families moved away from the flames only to find themselves pressed up against the boat's railings as panicked crowds pushed forward in search of fresh air. Children lost hold of their parents, never to see them again. Crowds surged toward the Slocum's 6 lifeboats and attempted to hoist them down. But they wouldn't budge. Somebody had wired them to the wall. The life preservers, never properly inspected, were filled with rotten cork, and several exploded into dust. They were not only useless, they were actually dangerous. Panicked parents strapped preservers to their children and tossed them overboard, only to watch in horror as they sank from sight. Below deck, passengers were burned to death, huddled in groups and trapped in corners. Smoke choked many, causing unconsciousness. Many were trampled underfoot. Some jumped into the violent waves. There was little hope that any of the children who jumped overboard could be saved, reported the New York Evening World. The current all along the course taken is on a section of the river where not even a strong swimmer can breast the currents. Scores of little ones were sucked in by the whirlpools in Hell Gate. The Slocum eventually floated out into the Long Island Sound, puffing clouds of cork dust into the air, while leaving a trail of tragedy in its wake. Story 2. Haunting on Clinton Avenue. On a cold December night in 1878, Edward F. Smith decided to walk down to the Myrtle Avenue police station. He hadn't had much sleep in the past 2 weeks and was beginning to question his own sanity. Mr. Smith was as passionate as a skeptic as he was a master builder. He worked in a world with tangible objects and rational fears. A world where ghosts and spirits were nothing but mere tales for distraction. However, for the past few weeks, Edward, his wife and his 2 young daughters had been terrorized by what they could only assume were phantoms living inside their old Knickerbocker-styled home on Clinton Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. Barging through the precinct's doors, Edward rattled the late shift awake. The few police officers unfortunate enough to work the late shift that cold night stopped and stared at the wild-eyed man. The man's bloodshot eyes conveyed a sense of deep disturbance and a desperate plead for help. "I need help. Someone has to help us." Edward told the officers about strange and disturbing activity occurring in his home on Clinton Avenue. He reported that someone or something had been pestering his family by ringing the front door excessively. Ringing in the middle of the night, and when he ran to check, there would be no one at the door. Edward went on to tell them that it wasn't just the ringing of the bell, but also loud knocks on their front door. There was also something else. Something terrifying enough that had made Edward trek down the icy streets to the police station in the middle of the night. He told the officers about his dining room, about how it and the kitchen were separated by heavy doors. Doors that shook violently at night as if someone was trying to shake them off their hinges. The officers looked at each other with yawning disbelief. However, seeing how upset and shaken Edward had become while explaining his situation, Detective Price decided it was worth investigating. Price instructed one of the officers to stand by the front door and sit and wait for the bell to be rung. When it did, he was to immediately open the door. He instructed the other one to hide and wait by the dining room, ready to pounce on the would-be pranksters Price was convinced was behind the phantom noises. During the middle of the night, as the Smiths' daughters lay in bed and their concerned parents entertained their guarding guests, as it had done for the past few weeks, the front door bell rang. Its metallic ringing echoed through the cold, dark house. Everyone froze. The officer standing by opened the door expecting to catch a child prankster in mid-act. Instead, he was greeted by the same uneasy emptiness that had been greeting the Smiths. The confused officer checked around and behind the massive pillars by the front door. Nothing, no one in sight. When asked, the officer told the detective that he had only felt a freezing gust of wind blow past him. He said that after the bell rang and he opened the door, there wasn't a soul in sight. The three policemen did a perimeter check of the property. The front porch sat about 40 feet back from the main street. The property was fenced, and it would have taken someone a considerable amount of effort and skills to run across the yard undetected and jump over the fence before the bell was answered. The uneasiness soon spread from one of the men to the other two, like the heavy coldness that began to creep in. They went back to the doorbell, and this time really taking their time to examine the rig. However, the baffled police found nothing out of the ordinary. No tricks, no wires, no mysterious springs that could have set off the bell. It became apparent to the policeman that the bell only rang because someone pressed the lever. The police came back to the family perturbed and empty-handed. Just then the doors that separated the dining room began to shake in a violent manner. Everyone in the living room jumped at the loud banging and thrashing noises that instantly filled the residence on 136 Clinton Avenue. The deafening clattering and banging against the doors shook the house's skeleton. Strong and loud enough to make Edward think that the once solid structure was about to collapse on top of them. However, just as the thunderous ruckus appeared to be shaking the entire house off its foundation, it abruptly ceased. Like the creeping cold, a dead silence soon engulfed the nervous crowd. The men inspected the entire house and the outside and found no signs of another person, prankster or not, outside in the freezing cold. It was then suggested that they sprinkle flour and ashes near the doors to try and catch the intruder's footprints. Once the trap was set, they all went back into the living room and waited. Not long after that, the banging and ringing broke the silence once again. Immediately the officers went to check on the traps they had set. They anticipated finding footprints that would lead them to the hidden prankster. When they neared the front door, the ringing stopped. Again they found no one on the other side of the door. Inspecting the flour and ash mixture yielded no settling answers. The flour remained undisturbed throughout the house, even though the ringing and banging of the doors sounded louder and more aggressive than before. Detective Price threw his hands up in despair. "This is too much. It's beyond me." Just then, in plain sight of the detective and everyone else, 3 loud knocks reverberated off the open front door. The keen-eyed detective stared at the emptiness in front of him, trying to make out a silhouette or a hand of the phantom knocker he had come to believe in. It was then that a brick crashed through one of the living room windows, landing on the wooded flooring with a heavy thud. The 2 officers quickly ran outside and, just like before, found not a living soul out in the streets. Story 3. Cropsey. Staten Island is a strange place. I can say this because I was born there. And while the island's obsession with hair gel and mozzarella borders on abnormal, far more frightening things have happened in New York City's forgotten borough. Such as the story of Cropsey, an urban legend that sprung to life in the form of Andre Rand. Just who is Cropsey, you ask? Cropsey is the creature that lurks at the end of your block. It's the shadowy figure that prowls the edge of the playground. Cropsey is Staten Island's personal boogeyman. According to lore, an insane man with a hook for a hand terrorized neighborhood boys and girls, dragging them into the crumbling ruins of Staten Island's abandoned Sayview Hospital. Parents used the tale to spook their little ones at night. Go to bed, or Cropsey will get you. But as the doc points out, Cropsey turned frighteningly real in the 1970s, when a local drifter named Andre Rand allegedly began attacking the children of Staten Island. Rand, born Frank Rushane, worked as a janitor at the Willowbrook State School, an institution for mentally disabled children not far from the ruins of Sayview. During its 40 years of operation, Willowbrook repeatedly came under fire for the mistreatment of its students. A young Geraldo R. revealed the institution's horrid conditions to the public in a 1972 expose. By 1987 the school was shuttered for good. Andre Rand left Willowbrook long before it closed. But many who believe in his guilt also believe his tenure at a facility notorious for abuse later influenced his crimes against children. The first youth to go missing in the string of disappearances was 5-year-old Alice P., who vanished in 1972 after playing with her brother. The second was 7-year-old Holly Ann H., who, according to witnesses, was spotted with Rand on the day of her disappearance in 1981. The third was 11-year-old Tahis J., who disappeared shortly after Rand was released from prison in 1983. The fourth was Hank G., a 22-year-old with a low IQ who was last seen with Rand at a diner in 1984. The bodies of the victims were never recovered. The final child was Jennifer S. in the summer of 1987. A 12-year-old with Down syndrome, Jennifer told her parents she was going for a walk but never returned. A massive search party commenced. Neighbors combed the empty lots and wooded parks of Staten Island. By this time Rand was homeless and living in a series of makeshift campsites. One of his outposts was built in the woods behind his old stomping grounds, Willowbrook State School. While searching for Jennifer near the shuttered school, a firefighter uncovered a small foot in the earth, which ultimately gave way to Jennifer's body buried in a shallow grave. Rand's camp was discovered shortly thereafter. Authorities quickly arrested the man and charged him with murder. In the court of public opinion, the case was open and shut. Rand was an ex-con with a record of crimes against children. In 1969, he was arrested in the South Bronx after attempting to hurt a young girl. In 1983, while working for a Staten Island school bus company, he kidnapped 11 children, bought them lunch, and drove them to New Jersey's Newark International Airport for no apparent reason. Yet there was very little concrete evidence that linked Rand to the actual murder of Jennifer S. In 1988, he was ultimately convicted of kidnapping in the first degree and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The jury was unable to reach a verdict on the murder charge, and so it fell. In 2004, just 4 years shy of becoming eligible for parole, Rand was put on trial once more. This time for the 23-year-old case of Holly Ann H. Prosecutors presented new evidence in the proceedings and a jury convicted Rand of kidnapping the little girl. He was sentenced to another 25 years. The cases of Tahis J., Alice P. and Hank G. all remain unsolved. In each, Rand is a prime suspect. But with the bodies still missing, they remain lost youths who fell victim to the Cropsey legend. I hope you enjoyed this episode from New York. To suggest the next state for us to cover or to let us know more New York stories we missed, just let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe while you are at it. Until next time. Goodbye.